observação, né, para aprendermos até na questão do tempo. Eu não sei como essa professora consegue, ela estava me perguntando agora quanto tempo ela pode falar. Porque se eu disser para ela 1 hora, ela vai falar em 1 hora. 60 minutos. Mas, Rebeca, por favor, você está no Brasil e você simplesmente tem a palavra pelo tempo que você quiser. Muito obrigada.
Thank you, Professor Sandra. I first want to thank all of you for having me here. It is a real privilege to come to Brazil and to get to be with all of you. I want to thank the public prosecutors, the judiciary, the presidents of the various agencies in Brazil for sponsoring this program. I especially want to thank my good friend Sandra, who has been a good friend to me for many years and has taught me so much about the legal world of Brazil. And I want to thank my very good friend, Professor Paulo Affonso, who has been a mentor to me. I hope I am among you as one of his disciples. I also want to thank the man who's probably the most important person here today. He is the translator. His name is Paul. And I trust that if I make a mistake, he will still make me sound brilliant. Right? Okay, good. I have been asked to speak for about an hour and a half, about 90 minutes, about the water laws in the United States and the way the public participates in those water laws. I'm going to be very general because I think today it's more important that we talk about concepts and philosophies than the very technical parts of the law. If you want to talk about the technical parts, I am happy to have that conversation. I understand we are going to have some debates afterwards, and I look forward to that. I actually would very much like to talk with you. So hopefully we can do that. Here's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to spend some time talking about the US legal system. I'm going to give you a little bit of history that I think helps explain why environmental law in the United States is crafted the way it is. I'm going to talk about the US water law regime, again, fairly generally, but I want to give you the basic concepts that create that water regime. I will speak about aspects of public participation, which I understand is a very important concept for you right now here in Brazil. And then I'm going to give you a recent case study. There has been a recent case in the United States that I think is interesting. It's very interesting for us, but also might be informative given the problems and the challenges that you have here today. But first, I'm going to tell you who I am, a little bit, just a little bit. I am a professor of environmental law at Vermont Law School, which you have heard. I have been promoted from being the director of the environmental programs to the dean. And I don't think that term translates, but like a vice president of innovation. And I'm talking about innovation in all of law, and particularly in the way law is taught in the United States. I want to emphasize that the environmental people often find themselves in these positions, because I think in environmental law in particular, we always have to be innovative. We often find ourselves in the middle of a crisis, and we have to figure something out. We often have to work with inadequate tools. We often have to be creative in the way we apply those tools. And so it is often natural when I find myself among people working in innovation, I find out that somewhere in their history, they worked in environmental law. I think all of you here today are going to be innovators. You may have to be creative to solve your problems, but that's what we're good at. That's what we do. This is me at 14. I know that Professor Paulo Affonso has a deep love for the Piracicaba River. I have a deep love for a little river in my native state of Oregon called the Umpqua. It's an Indian name, and it is the best place to fish, I think, in the United States. But don't go fish there, because it's where I get to fish. Everybody has to leave that river alone. I spent many years traveling with my father, who is a geologist in the field. This picture was taken a few years ago in British Columbia, in some of the lakes very close to the Arctic Circle. And I am willing to go to these places to see beautiful water, even when the mosquitoes are the size of city buses, which is why you wear a head net anywhere you go out there. And this is me 3 weeks ago. I was in Uganda working with some environmental groups, and I got an opportunity to go to the headwaters of the Nile River. The Nile River may be the most historic and most troubled river we all know about, but it still is a place of beauty. And often, I am happiest when I am in a boat with a beer. But I want to tell you about the most important person in my life. And that is my grandmother. My grandmother is the child of Swedish immigrants and came to the United States back when Swedes were not considered to be white people. They were considered to be colored. There's a weird, interesting history on that if you want to know. But she did, her family did, what many immigrants do when they are a minority in a country and when they do not speak the language, which is she farmed. It's the one thing you can do if you cannot participate otherwise in society, you can grow food to feed yourself. Unfortunately, she farmed in an area of the world, of the country, that became the space of the largest ecological disaster in the United States. And that is the Midwest in the 1930s. I think some people know of this, but I was a little surprised to hear that maybe not all Brazilians know this piece of history. And it's really fundamental to why we have the environmental laws we have. Because of poor farming practices and drought, and a couple of incredible storms, windstorms, much of the Midwest, much of the area we grow most of our food, was actually destroyed in large dust storms like this. It was called the Dust Bowl, and it extended from almost from the Canadian border, if I can get this, all the way down through Oklahoma into Texas. The soils just literally blew away, and it mostly went down into this area of Texas, and when the soils landed there, choked out much of the rangeland. So not only did we lose our growing soils, but it destroyed the rangeland where the cattle was kept. This is a massive ecological disaster in our history, and is really the beginning of what began to form the need and the understanding for environmental laws in the country. The refugees from the Midwest, from all of these farms, migrated west, and it is really how California became populated. It is also why California has a large agricultural sector, because that's about all those people knew how to do. And it was mostly immigrants, and it was mostly poor immigrants who were considered non-majority, which often is minorities, but again, even the Swedes were considered minorities at the time. I want to tell you just a little bit of US ecological history, just to form what we're going to talk about in the Water Act, because I think it is helpful to understand. So, a quick history. I think you all know about the stock market crash and the depression that began in the 1920s. That was an economic disaster. But in the 1930s and 40s, that economic disaster was compounded by the Dust Bowl, by this ecological disaster, the loss of cropland, and the migration of hundreds of thousands of refugees. In the 1940s, we had the Second World War, and the way we really recovered from that ecological disaster was we went to war, we built factories, and everyone went back to work. The Second World War really is the reason I think most know that we became such a superpower in the world, and it was the economic power of all of these unemployed people who suddenly got jobs and were able to create a large manufacturing class. If we had remained agrarian, I'm not sure we would have had the work resource to be able to populate those factories without a large impact on our agricultural systems. So we built factories, we built tanks, we built chemical weapons, we built nuclear bombs, everything. Then from 1945 to the 1960s, we took those factories that had been created in the Second World War to fuel the war effort, and we put those factories to work on consumer goods. So the people who had been building tanks, 5 years later, began building cars. And that large manufacturing sector was prepared. They didn't have to build new factories. They didn't have to build new techniques. They already had supply chains for raw materials financed by the war effort. So the conversion to a large manufacturing base and the conversion to a large consumer base was fairly easy. It was cheaper than it has been for most people in the world. problem is, from 1945 to 1960, we also made a big mess. We managed to pollute and pollute and pollute from that industry. And in the late 1960s, we were so polluted we could not pretend anymore that we were not. We could not ignore. And very famously, a river in Ohio caught fire. This is the Cuyahoga River. And it burned for over a week. They couldn't put it out, and it was the combination of oil but other chemicals. And the chemicals mixed with the oil just made the fire impossible to stop. It's in this context that we began to pass environmental laws. And folks have often noted that the US got to environmental regulation perhaps earlier than other countries, or at least the kind of environmental regulation. It's because we had this history of industry that created such problems. By the late 1960s and the early 1970s, we had massive clusters of cancer. Whole entire elementary schools, children would all have leukemia or be sick. Entire workforces in certain factories would all be dying at 45. The combination of the human impact and rivers burning was enough to get the attention of the people and the attention of the legislature. And so we began creating environmental statutes. I have said in other contexts that this is both wonderful and terrible. It was wonderful because we got early environmental legislation. But the science was not as developed as it is today, and we have been held to these environmental laws in the stasis they were in the 1970s. They are sometimes antiquated. Today I will talk about water, but when you talk about biodiversity, our environmental laws are very much creatures of the 1970s. Our Endangered Species Act, for example, was created before we really understood the interweb of ecology. And our Endangered Species Act was passed and managed before we really understood modern genetics and what a species is. So while we are lucky to have had early laws, we also have to live with these sometimes antiquated concepts. I just want to emphasize this picture. This picture is very famous in the United States. Is it familiar to some folks? I see a few nods. This is probably the most famous picture from the Depression, and most people think of this picture as a depression photo, an economic depression photo. I'm sorry? Somebody recognized it. But the photo itself is actually of environmental refugees. These are folks who had left farms, like my grandmother, because they could no longer farm. This is really our depression, not the economic piece, but the ecological and agricultural piece. So with that context, that was just a little history, I want to tell you a little bit about just how the US legal system is created. I presume most folks here have an idea, so I will be very quick, but I am happy to answer questions. Like everyone, we have a legislature. This is Congress. We had elections on Tuesday. Now our entire Congress is controlled by the Republicans. Overwhelmingly by the Republicans, both houses. We have a president, you might know him. And we have a judiciary. Professor Paulo Affonso likes me to describe the Supreme Court, so I'm going to tell you just a little bit about how it is constituted. The Supreme Court justices are nominated by the president, and they are confirmed by the legislature. All of them. Including the Chief Justice of that Supreme Court. That person, when our last Chief Justice died, our president nominated the next Chief Justice. But Congress still has to approve. The power of the Supreme Court is significant. And most people say the most important thing a president will ever do is choose certain justices to be nominated and to be confirmed to the Supreme Court. It is the judges that will outlive any president, and that is often the most important legacy. One of the interesting controversies right now is the woman here. That is Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She is amazing. She is the kind of person that people will put on t-shirts. I am a Ruth baby is a common phrase you will hear among college girls. She is a liberal justice. And some people who are liberals are very angry with her right now. She is in her 80s, she has had cancer twice, and there's a strong feeling that she should step down before President Obama leaves office. Because if President Obama finishes, and a Republican takes over, the Republican will get to appoint her replacement. Ruth Bader Ginsburg has said, no, I'm not leaving. This is my job. I have it for life. I'm still alive. I plan to live forever. So back off. The liberals are angry for two reasons. One, the liberals would like President Obama to be able to appoint a liberal justice. But the concern is larger than that. The concern is that if after the next election we have a Republican governor and a Republican Congress, those together will appoint a very conservative and, more importantly, a very political judge. The feeling is now, if President Obama, as a Democrat, nominates a judge and the Republican Congress has to confirm, we will get a more neutral judge. We will get more of a jurist and less of a politician. And there's a strong feeling that that would be better for this court. So although the judges are not supposed to be political, we have seen them become more political in several years, and even the nomination process has become contentious, more so than it ever was in the past. There's one, so we have three branches of government. There's one, I think, important distinction that I need to make, particularly different than Brazil. And that is that we have no public prosecutor. There is no independence of the prosecutorial system. The public prosecutor, the Attorney General, is appointed by the President and is a political appointment and makes political decisions about what cases to bring and what cases not to bring. Someone asked me earlier today about marijuana laws in the United States. It's a very complicated issue, but there has been one interesting aspect to those. Marijuana laws have been passed in a couple of individual states, making marijuana legal. The Obama administration has said politically that although it is illegal at the federal level, the public prosecutor just won't prosecute those crimes in those states. So it has that level of political agenda. The president can decide, or the attorney general can decide what to prosecute, can also decide it's illegal, but we're just not going to go there. We have a constitution, as you know. Compared to your constitution, ours is very short. It's only 6 pages. And it was written in the 1800s by a bunch of white guys. So a little bit like our environmental laws, it's kind of old. We have to work with what we've got. Most of our constitutional law has actually evolved from this document. It is not a civil code type constitution. It doesn't actually give much specificity at all. The specificity is fairly general. And the Constitution gives power to the federal government. The presumption, and this is key, the presumption is that the states have all of the power. And the Constitution took a few things away from the states. So the federal government can only do those things that the Constitution allowed it to do. And think about what white guys in 1800s would think about for the federal government. This is a long time ago. They said the federal government should have a military. The federal government should have a post office. The federal government should do money, should make coins and bills. And the federal government should figure out weights and measures. How long an inch is, how big a foot is, how much a pound is. Those kinds of basic concepts for federal government. But most of the other authority was actually left to the states. Education, environment. Many of these things were left to the state government, at least under the old Constitution. What has happened over time is that the federal government has used powers in the Constitution to exert authority over the states that probably weren't in the original document. And we'll talk about a couple of those powers in particular. One easy example is that the federal government has the power to tax. State governments can pass taxes too. I don't know if this happens in Brazil, but yeah, we pay at both levels. The federal government has the power to tax and has the power to spend that money. So it uses that power to spend to bully the states into doing what it wants. It says, the federal government says, we will give every state hundreds of millions of dollars for education. But if you want the money, you have to do education our way. You cannot do education our way, but then you don't get this big grant from the federal government. So the tax and spend authority is an old constitutional tool that has been used to control state behavior. Every once in a while, in an area, the state will say, no, we're going to go it alone. we'll manage without your money. That usually doesn't last very long, but it is at least a power that the state has. The states retain many powers, but increasingly this kind of use of the Constitution has usurped state powers. I want to talk very briefly about sources of law, because we really have three different kinds of law in the United States. Like everyone, we have statutory law. We have laws passed by the legislatures. But as I mentioned, those have to be derived from some power in the Constitution. Every time Congress sits down and wants to pass a law, they first have to look back to that original 6 pages and say, here's why we're allowed to do that. For today, we will be talking about one particular power the federal government has, and that is the Commerce Clause. If you think again, 300 years ago, when you had a whole bunch of old guys making a constitution, they were trying to figure out the sorts of things the federal government could regulate. And one of the things they thought was important was trade between the states. They did not want New York and California to get into a trade war. So they said, when we're talking about trading inside the United States, the federal government has control. That control is called the Commerce Clause, and it has become the underpinning of many environmental laws and regulations. I'll talk more about that in a minute. We also have the common law, and we again derive most of our laws from England. Common laws are laws that are passed down through court decisions. One example are what we call torts. Private actions. If Professor Paulo Affonso cuts down a tree on my land, there's no law against that. I might be unhappy about it, but there's no law against that. I have to rely on common law doctrines. I have to rely on the common law of trespass to sue him for the damage he has done to my property. This is all coming down through the common law, no statutes at all. In water, although we have a statute about the quality of water, most of our water allocation, most of our laws around water withdrawal, all comes from the common law. It comes down from these judicial decisions, and I'll describe that in a minute. And we also have a common law doctrine called the public trust doctrine. This is something I think you guys have emboldened in your Constitution, but the idea that public resources are held by the government in trust for the people. They are held in trust for future generations. Our public trust doctrine is powerful, but it has some interesting aspects that again I will describe. And again, this all comes from judge-made law. The power of common law that I think is maybe a little different than in Brazil and certainly in other countries is that once a judge has made a decision, that decision stands based on the doctrine of stare decisis. You have to follow the decision that has come from the court. You are beholden to at least the highest court in your area. So if the US Supreme Court has made a decision, all other courts must abide. If the Supreme Court hasn't made a decision, but an appellate court has made a decision, all of the courts underneath that appellate court must abide. It holds as law the same as a statute. We also have an area of law called constitutional law. It is the common law that derives from the Constitution. The Constitution is so bloody old that it doesn't say many of the things that we have to understand. Here's an easy example. The Constitution doesn't say anything about the internet. It doesn't say anything about your right to privacy on the internet. It doesn't say anything about, frankly, the original Constitution didn't say many nice things about women either. So over time, the judges of the Supreme Court have had to make common law that interprets the rights within the Constitution. And again, stare decisis applies. Once the Supreme Court has made a decision, that decision applies going forward. Okay, enough with the history. I want to tell you a little bit about our Clean Water Act. This is, again, a statute that is passed by the federal government and derived